My name is Brian. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in environments where influence mattered more than volume. Corporate rooms with glass walls, quiet hallways where decisions were made long before meetings officially began. I've never been the loudest voice in those spaces. I wasn't the charismatic performer or the natural networker. If anything, people tended to describe me as reliable, measured, maybe even forgettable. The kind of person you trust with important work, but not the kind you worry about competing with. That perception followed me for years. I learned early that when you don't advertise your ambition, others are quick to assign limits to it. I was often underestimated, not aggressively, not cruelly, but casually, overlooked in small ways, talked over, spoken for, occasionally spoken down to. It wasn't dramatic enough to spark outrage, and not severe enough to justify confrontation. It was just normalized. And that's often how power imbalances survive. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about outsmarting someone in a single cinematic moment or delivering a perfectly timed monologue that silences a room. What happened unfolded slowly, quietly, and almost invisibly until it didn't. It's about restraint, about watching someone mistake proximity to power for actual power and confidence for competence, and about what happens when flattery replaces substance for too long. At the center of this is an office dynamic many people recognize: the sycophant, the person who seems untouchable because they orbit the right people, say the right things, and always manage to be seen, especially by those at the top. For a long time, I existed on the opposite end of that spectrum. I did the work. I stayed professional. I didn't perform loyalty. I practiced responsibility. And for years, that difference didn't seem to matter. This isn't a story about humiliation or public shaming. No voices were raised, no secrets were leaked, no rules were broken. What did happen was the result of patience, documentation, and letting someone reveal themselves fully at the exact moment when it counted most. I didn't push. I didn't bait aggressively. I simply stepped back and allowed momentum to do what it always does when it's built on insecurity instead of skill. What you'll hear over the next parts is an honest account of how subtle disrespect compounds over time, how silence can be mistaken for submission, and how quiet preparation can outweigh loud performance. There's no hero here, and no villain in the cartoon sense, just people making choices, and living with the consequences of those choices when the spotlight finally turns in the wrong direction. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, genuinely, not rhetorically. Have you ever noticed how often the calmest person in the room is assumed to have the least leverage? In the company's internal language, I was what you'd call solid, not rising star, not risk, solid. The kind of word people use when they don't feel the need to look any closer. To most of them, I was background architecture, useful, dependable, and largely invisible. I was the one who stayed after meetings to reconcile numbers that didn't quite align, the one who sent follow-up notes no one replied to, but everyone relied on weeks later. When projects succeeded, my name lived in spreadsheets, not conversations. When something went wrong, people knew exactly which desk to walk toward. I wasn't resentful about it, at least not consciously. I told myself I preferred it this way. Less politics, less noise, more control. There's a certain safety in being underestimated. No one watches you too closely. No one guards their words around you. No one imagines you're keeping track. And to be fair, I didn't give them much reason to think otherwise. I didn't interrupt. I didn't perform confidence. I spoke when I had something precise to say, and then I stopped. In meetings, my comments were often acknowledged with a nod, and then rephrased, louder, by someone else 10 minutes later. That version would be praised. Mine would be forgotten. This happened so often that it became almost rhythmic, like background music you stop noticing after a while. There was a story they told themselves about me. I could feel it. Brian's great with details. Brian's not really political. Brian's not the kind of guy who wants more. It wasn't said maliciously. It was said comfortably, as if my role had already been agreed upon without my participation. At company events, I was polite, neutral, easily placed. I didn't hover near executives, didn't laugh too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, didn't angle my body toward power. I listened more than I spoke. That alone was enough for people to assume I lacked ambition. In reality, I just didn't confuse visibility with leverage. Still, perception has weight. Over time, it presses into you. I noticed how people would speak freely in front of me, assuming discretion equaled insignificance. I noticed how decisions were discovered by me after they were already framed, even when my analysis had shaped them weeks earlier. I noticed how credit drifted, not stolen outright, just redirected, gently, almost politely. And then there was him. The office sycophant didn't arrive loudly. He never does. He arrived smiling, observant, eager. He learned names fast, remembered birthdays, quoted leadership back to leadership, complimented people in public, and positioned himself in private. He had a talent for being seen in the right places, at the right times, and for making sure others weren't. To him, I barely registered. That was the interesting part. In group settings, he'd speak over me without even realizing it. Not aggressively, more like I was furniture, something you talk past, not to. In one-on-ones, he'd nod at my input, then repeat it later as if it had just occurred to him. When I didn't object, he assumed agreement, or weakness, or both. From the outside, it probably looked like I accepted my place, like I was content being useful, but unthreatening. And maybe, at one point, I was. Or maybe I just hadn't yet seen how permanent those assumptions could become if left unchallenged. The thing about being underestimated is that it teaches you a lot if you're paying attention. You learn how narratives are formed, how confidence fills gaps where competence should be, how silence is interpreted not as restraint, but as absence. I didn't hate them for it. I didn't even resent him. I simply observed, and I learned what they thought I was. Because before you can change a dynamic like that, you have to understand it fully, not emotionally, structurally. At that stage, I was still just Brian, reliable, quiet, safe, and in their minds, completely predictable. The first moment wasn't dramatic. That's why it stayed with me. If it had been sharp or loud, I might have reacted instinctively. If it had been openly disrespectful, I could have named it, addressed it, maybe even resolved it. But it wasn't any of those things. It was subtle, clean, almost forgettable, which is exactly why everyone else forgot it. We were in a mid-level strategy meeting, nothing glamorous. 12 people, a glass-walled room, half the seats filled by laptops rather than bodies. I had spent the better part of 2 weeks preparing the operational risk assessment for a proposal leadership was excited about, but hadn't fully thought through. Not to block it, just to make sure it didn't break something 6 months later. When my turn came, I spoke plainly, no theatrics. I laid out 3 pressure points, each backed by data, each solvable with small adjustments. The room was quiet, not tense, just listening. Then he leaned back in his chair. He smiled, the way people do when they think they're about to say something reassuring. "I think we might be overthinking this," he said lightly. "The board's not really concerned about edge case risks right now. They want momentum." That was it. No direct contradiction, no insult, just a reframing that subtly repositioned my contribution as unnecessary caution, the kind that sounds reasonable if you're not the one who did the work. A few heads nodded, someone typed something, the conversation moved on. I remember sitting there, hands folded, feeling something register. Not anger, not embarrassment, but awareness, like noticing a hairline crack in glass. You don't panic, but you don't forget it either. What made it sting wasn't what he said, it was how easily it landed. No one asked me to clarify, no one challenged the dismissal, not because they disagreed with me, but because his confidence filled the space faster than my explanation could. He didn't need to be right. He just needed to sound aligned with what leadership supposedly wanted. After the meeting, 2 colleagues stopped by my desk. "Good points in there," one said. "Yeah, really thorough," the other added. Both meant well, both also confirmed something quietly unsettling. My value was acknowledged privately, but neutralized publicly. And then there was him again. Later that week, I heard my own points repeated, slightly simplified, slightly reframed. In a leadership update he delivered, not credited, not intentionally stolen, just absorbed. Delivered with certainty instead of caution, with momentum instead of nuance. The room received them differently that time. I could have spoken up. I could have said, "That's actually something I raised earlier," or, "We discussed those risks already." It would have been true. It also would have changed the temperature in a way that would make me look defensive, petty, political. So I didn't. That choice mattered more than I realized at the time. Because silence, once observed, becomes expected. From that point on, small cuts multiplied. A comment brushed aside. A clarification skipped. An idea acknowledged only when it came from a louder mouth. None of it severe enough to escalate, all of it consistent enough to form a pattern. And patterns teach people what they can get away with. He learned that I wouldn't challenge him publicly. Others learned that my presence didn't require deference. I learned that competence alone does not protect your contributions. What stayed with me most was how normal it all felt to everyone else. No discomfort, no tension, just another meeting, another decision, another quiet recalibration of status. That's when I understood something important. This wasn't about him yet. It was about the environment that allowed that moment to pass without friction. And once you see that clearly, you start to realize how dangerous small moments can be because they set expectations without ever announcing themselves. I didn't react, I didn't confront, I didn't complain. But I remembered, and that, as it turned out, was enough. After that first moment, nothing changed on the surface. That's what made it easy to ignore at first. The meetings continued, the projects moved forward, emails were sent, metrics were tracked, deadlines were met. If you looked at my calendar or my output, you'd see consistency, reliability, the same version of me doing the same quality of work. But underneath that, something subtle was taking shape. Disrespect doesn't usually announce itself. It accumulates. It settles in like dust. Thin layers you don't notice until you realize you've been breathing it in for months. He grew more comfortable interrupting me. Not aggressively, not dismissively, just seamlessly. I'd be mid-sentence, explaining a constraint or walking through a dependency, and he'd jump in to summarize. His summaries were never inaccurate enough to challenge, just incomplete enough to redirect the conversation toward his priorities. And each time I let it happen, I told myself I was choosing professionalism over ego, that this was about the work, not recognition, that pushing back would only create friction and distract from outcomes. All of that was true, up to a point. But there's a difference between restraint and erasure. I didn't fully see where that line was until I'd crossed it repeatedly. It became normal for him to answer questions that were directed at me. Normal for my follow-ups to be ignored until someone else rephrased them. Normal for leadership to associate my area of expertise with his voice. No one was conspiring. That's the uncomfortable truth. This wasn't coordinated. It was emergent behavior, a system rewarding visibility over accuracy, confidence over care. And I was complicit in my own marginalization. I remember one meeting in particular. A senior executive asked a technical question about downstream risk. It was squarely in my domain. I opened my mouth to respond, and he cut in immediately, offering a simplified reassurance. The executive nodded, satisfied. The meeting moved on. Afterward, the executive emailed me privately asking for a bit more detail, just in case. I sent a thorough response. He thanked me. Nothing changed. That's when I started rationalizing the pattern. I told myself, this is just how things work here. He's better at presentation. I'm better at execution. As long as the right decisions are made, it doesn't matter who says them. Those thoughts weren't lies. They were half-truths. And half-truths are incredibly effective at keeping you quiet. What I didn't say out loud was this. Every time I stayed silent, I was reinforcing an assumption about my role. Reliable, but not authoritative. Knowledgeable, but not influential. Useful, but not essential. And once a role like that solidifies, it becomes self-sustaining. People stopped checking in with me early. They looped me in, once decisions were already framed. My job became validation, not shaping. Execution, not direction. The work didn't change, but my position within it did. He, on the other hand, thrived. He learned how to speak just confidently enough, without committing to specifics, how to align himself verbally with whoever had the most power in the room, how to borrow certainty from proximity. When things went well, he was visible. When things didn't, he was vague. And I watched it all without intervening. Not because I was afraid, because I was studying. I started paying closer attention, not to his words, but to the effects of his words. What happened after meetings, which actions were actually taken, which risks quietly landed back on my desk weeks later. I noticed that when things became complicated, people came to me, not him. When things needed explaining, documenting, fixing, I was the one they trusted. His influence was loud, but shallow. Mine was deep, but hidden. At the time, I still believed depth would eventually speak for itself. That belief kept me quiet longer than it should have. There's a point where normalization becomes endorsement, where staying silent no longer preserves professionalism, but signals permission. I didn't realize I'd crossed that point until the dynamic felt settled, as if this was simply how things were now. And that's when it hit me. If I continued this way, nothing would ever force a correction, not competence, not consistency, not time. Because systems don't self-correct unless something interrupts them. And I hadn't decided yet what that interruption would be. It wasn't a single realization. It was a slow alignment of moments that finally formed a shape I couldn't ignore. I had been assigned a role, not officially, not in writing, but socially, strategically, unmistakably. I was the stabilizer, the one you bring in when something is already moving and you want to make sure it doesn't fall apart. The one you trust to clean up edges, anticipate consequences, and absorb complexity without needing recognition. I wasn't the face of ideas. I was the insurance policy behind them. And insurance, by design, is invisible until something goes wrong. Once I saw that clearly, I started noticing how consistently people interacted with me through that lens. Invitations to meetings came late, if at all. Decisions were shared as updates, not questions. My feedback was sought in private, then filtered through someone else in public. No one was being cruel. That was the most unsettling part. They were being efficient with their assumptions. He fit neatly into the complementary role. He was the translator of ambition, the one who made leadership feel confident, even when confidence wasn't fully earned. He spoke in certainties where I spoke in probabilities. He made things sound inevitable, not conditional. And in environments where speed was praised, that mattered. Together, we formed an unspoken structure. He created momentum. I managed consequences. Except only one of those roles was visible. I remember sitting in the quarterly review, watching a slide deck he was presenting. Several of the risk mitigations listed, my work, were there. Not attributed, not misrepresented, just detached from their source. As he spoke, I realized something uncomfortable. Everyone in that room believed this was his understanding. Not because he had lied, but because I had allowed the assumption to form. After the meeting, a director approached me and said, "Great support on that project. You really help keep things grounded." Support. That word landed heavier than it should have. Support is valuable, but it's also subordinate. It exists in relation to someone else's direction. And in that moment, I understood that no matter how well I performed, this was the ceiling of how I was seen. I wasn't angry, I was clear. Clarity has a way of stripping emotion out of situations. Once you see the structure, you stop personalizing the outcome. This wasn't about my worth. It was about my position within a system that rewarded different behaviors than the ones I practiced. The question became, do I accept this role, or do I change how I engage with the system? For a while, I did neither. I observed. I paid attention to how often my silence was interpreted as agreement, how my calm was mistaken for compliance, how my lack of self-promotion allowed others to speak for me, sometimes accurately, sometimes conveniently. I also noticed something else. People assumed I would always be there, always available, always steady, always willing to step in quietly and make things work. That assumption was leverage. I just hadn't decided how or if I would ever use it. The shift didn't come from frustration. It came from recognizing that roles, once assigned, don't dissolve on their own. They calcify, and the longer you inhabit them, the harder they are to escape. I wasn't invisible because I lacked substance. I was invisible because my substance was predictable. And predictability, in certain environments, is a liability. That's when I stopped asking myself how to be seen more clearly. I started asking a different question entirely. What would happen if I stopped being predictable? Not disruptive, not confrontational, just less available to be taken for granted. I didn't act on it yet, but the idea settled in my mind and stayed there. Because once you recognize the role others have assigned you, you have two options: play it perfectly forever, or change the conditions that made it necessary. And I wasn't ready to play it forever. The day everything shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no raised voice, no moment where someone finally crossed a line. In fact, if you had asked anyone else what stood out about that day, they probably would have struggled to remember it at all. But for me, it was the day the internal math stopped adding up. It happened during a late afternoon meeting, one of those sessions scheduled at the end of the day when people are already thinking about leaving. Leadership wanted a quick alignment before an upcoming presentation to external stakeholders. Nothing final, just a temperature check. I had reviewed the materials earlier that morning and noticed a gap. Not a flaw exactly, but an assumption that hadn't been tested. The kind that doesn't show up immediately, but unravels under scrutiny, especially from someone outside the organization. The kind of someone who doesn't care about internal narratives. When the discussion opened, he spoke first. Confident. Polished. He walked through the plan as if it were airtight, emphasizing momentum, simplicity, and alignment. Heads nodded, pens moved. Time was clearly being optimized. I waited. When there was a pause, I spoke. Not urgently, not defensively. I pointed out the assumption and suggested a small adjustment. A contingency. Something that would cost very little now and save a lot later. The room went quiet for a moment. Then he smiled and said, "I think that's a bit conservative for this audience. We don't want to complicate the message." There it was again, calm, dismissive, framed as strategic instinct. And something in me shifted, not emotionally, but cognitively. I realized that this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a pattern where my role was to surface risk, and his role was to decide whether it mattered. Except he didn't carry the consequences of being wrong. I did. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to explain further. I didn't justify. I didn't argue. I didn't try to persuade. I simply nodded. That surprised him. It surprised me too. The meeting ended shortly after. People packed up. Casual comments were exchanged. As I gathered my things, one of the executives lingered and said, "Let's trust the direction for now." I agreed. And I meant it, just not in the way they assumed. Later that evening, sitting alone at my desk, I reviewed the same materials again. But this time, I wasn't thinking about how to fix the gap. I was thinking about ownership. Who was accountable if this assumption failed? Who was presenting it? Who was being seen as the architect? The answers were suddenly very clear. Up until that point, I had been operating under an unspoken rule. If I see a problem, I'm responsible for preventing it. That rule had kept things running smoothly and kept me permanently in the background. That night, I quietly broke it. Not by sabotaging anything, not by withholding information, but by redefining my responsibility. I documented my analysis, thoroughly, objectively. I shared it, privately, with the appropriate channels. No commentary, no emotion, just facts, probabilities, and assumptions clearly labeled. And then I stopped pushing. That was the real shift. For the first time, I allowed space for someone else's confidence to be tested without my constant reinforcement. I didn't interfere, I didn't rescue, I didn't smooth over. I just let the system move forward with full visibility of the risks, on record. Walking out of the building that night, I felt calm, not tense, not excited, just resolved. I understood something then that I hadn't before. Silence can be passive, or it can be intentional. Up until that day, mine had been the former. From that moment on, it became the latter. I wasn't withdrawing, I wasn't disengaging, I was repositioning. And once that internal line was crossed, there was no going back to how things were before. Because when you stop trying to correct every outcome, you start seeing who actually owns them. That day didn't change how others treated me, at least not yet. But it fundamentally changed how I saw the game I was in. And once you see it clearly, you don't play it the same way again. After that day, my silence felt different. Before, it had been reactive, a pause while I decided whether something was worth correcting. Now, it was deliberate, measured, chosen in advance rather than defaulted to in the moment. And the difference was subtle enough that no one noticed right away. I still attended the same meetings. I still delivered my work on time. I still answered questions when they were asked directly. On the surface, nothing changed. But internally, I was no longer trying to steer the room. That responsibility had been quietly returned to the people who claimed it. He mistook this shift immediately. Where I once offered clarifications, I now offered acknowledgments. Where I once followed up with caveats, I now followed up with summaries. Clear, neutral, documented. In meetings, when he made confident assertions, I didn't jump in to refine them. I let them stand exactly as stated. When someone asked a vague question and he answered broadly, I didn't add context. I took notes. He interpreted my restraint as retreat. You could see it in how he leaned further into the space. He spoke longer, positioned himself closer to leadership, started framing discussions with "we've already aligned on this," even when alignment was shallow at best. Others followed his lead. Without my quiet corrections, his confidence filled the gaps more completely. Decisions moved faster. Fewer caveats were raised. Meetings ended earlier. On the surface, it looked like efficiency. Underneath, the assumptions stacked up. I didn't warn anyone again, not publicly, not privately. I had already documented what mattered. I had already shared it through the proper channels. From there, it was no longer my role to convince, it was my role to observe. What surprised me most was how quickly people adjusted to my new posture. No one asked why I was quieter. No one checked in to see if I disagreed. They simply accepted that my earlier concerns had either been resolved or abandoned. That told me everything I needed to know. My previous efforts hadn't been valued as insight. They had been valued as insurance, and now that insurance appeared unnecessary, people were happy to proceed without it. He, in particular, grew more comfortable dismissing complexity. He started using phrases like low risk, edge case, unlikely scenario, always with a smile, always with confidence, always without data. And I let him, not because I wanted him to fail, but because I wanted ownership to be unambiguous. There's a difference between letting someone make a mistake and letting them reveal a pattern. I wasn't waiting for a single failure. I was watching for consistency. Every meeting, every decision, every skipped contingency added another line to a story he was telling about himself, that he understood the system well enough to simplify it. Meanwhile, I was doing something else entirely. I was mapping. I tracked which claims were made publicly, which assumptions were stated as facts, which risks were deferred. I noted who was present, who nodded, who stayed silent. I saved emails. I archived decks. I timestamped everything. Quiet work, invisible work, the kind I'd always done, but now with a different intention. I wasn't preparing a confrontation. I wasn't building a case against him. I was building clarity, because if the moment ever came when accountability mattered, I wanted there to be no confusion about who had said what and when. As weeks passed, the tone shifted. Leadership grew more comfortable, plans grew bolder, external exposure increased, and with it, the stakes. He thrived in that environment. He spoke like someone already celebrated, like someone whose trajectory was inevitable, and I stayed exactly where I was, calm, observant, unremarkable. That, ironically, made me even less visible, which only reinforced his confidence. Silence, when misunderstood, invites overreach, and overreach doesn't collapse on its own. It needs space, time, and just enough rope to reveal itself. I wasn't pulling that rope. I was simply not holding it anymore. While everyone else adjusted to the new rhythm, they missed what was actually changing. From their perspective, things had simplified. Fewer objections, faster alignment, clear direction. It felt like progress. And in organizations like ours, progress, real or perceived, is intoxicating. What they didn't notice was that I hadn't stopped working. I'd simply stopped performing the work publicly. The late nights didn't disappear. The analysis didn't stop. The habit of asking, what happens next, didn't fade. It just moved out of the room and into a quieter space, one without applause or interruption. I began documenting differently, not just conclusions, but assumptions, not just decisions, but dependencies. I tracked how often risks were reframed as unlikely, how frequently timelines compressed without structural changes, how often certainty replaced verification. I wasn't doing this out of suspicion. I was doing it out of pattern recognition. Every system leaves fingerprints. Every narrative leaves gaps. And when people grow confident, they stop checking whether those gaps are visible. I noticed how often my previous cautions reappeared, weeks later, as unexpected challenges, how frequently teams scrambled to adjust for things I'd already flagged, quietly, internally, too late to change direction. And still, no one looked my way. They assumed I was aligned, or disengaged, or simply content to support. That assumption bought me time. I also started paying closer attention to access. Who was included early, who received drafts versus final versions, who spoke directly to leadership, and who relayed through intermediaries. Over time, a map emerged, not of people, but of influence, of how information actually moved, as opposed to how the org chart claimed it did. And then there was the shareholder. The company's largest external stakeholder wasn't involved in day-to-day operations, but when they showed up, everything slowed down. Words were chosen more carefully. Claims were scrutinized. Confidence alone didn't carry the room. I had seen this before. Years earlier, I'd supported a different initiative that had gone through their review. I remembered the kinds of questions they asked, the patterns they noticed, the assumptions they challenged. They didn't reward enthusiasm, they rewarded coherence. And I realized something important. The narrative currently being built wouldn't survive that kind of attention. Not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. That was when preparation stopped being abstract. I began organizing my work as if it would eventually be read by someone who didn't know any of us. Someone who didn't care about internal politics. Someone who would ask, "Show me how this holds up." Every document I touched from that point on had a second audience in mind. I didn't share this with anyone, not because it was secret, but because it wasn't relevant yet. He continued to position himself as the face of the initiative. He grew more relaxed, less precise. His language shifted from "we believe" to "we know," from "we're evaluating" to "this is locked." Certainty is seductive when no one challenges it. I remember watching him present an updated plan in a leadership meeting, outlining timelines and outcomes with absolute assurance. Several assumptions I had flagged months earlier were still unresolved, but now they were invisible, buried under momentum. No one asked about them. I didn't raise my hand. Afterwards, someone joked that it was nice to finally have decisive leadership on the project. People laughed. The mood was light. That was the moment I knew the system was set. From then on, my role was no longer to influence the path. It was to ensure the record was accurate. I archived everything: version histories, meeting notes, email threads where decisions were implicitly made. I kept my language neutral, factual, and consistent. If someone asked me directly, I answered honestly, but narrowly. No extrapolation, no unsolicited foresight, and still, no one noticed. They didn't notice because they weren't looking. They had already decided who mattered in the room. And when that happens, the quiet person becomes the safest place to hide information in plain sight. I wasn't invisible, I was underestimated, and that difference was about to matter. The leverage didn't arrive all at once. There was no single email, no dramatic discovery, no moment where everything suddenly clicked into place. What happened instead was quieter and far more decisive. It came through contrast. An internal draft crossed my desk late one evening. It was a polished summary intended for external review, written in the confident, forward-facing language leadership preferred. I had seen versions of it before. This one was more refined, more assertive, less conditional. As I read it, something felt familiar. Not wrong, just incomplete in a way I recognized. I opened my own files and began comparing, line by line, assumption by assumption, what the draft claimed versus what had actually been validated. What was framed as resolved versus what had merely been deferred. That's when the pattern revealed itself fully. The initiative hadn't evolved past its original uncertainties. Those uncertainties had simply been narrated out of existence. And the narrator was clear. He hadn't fabricated anything. That was important. Every claim could be traced back to something real, a discussion, a preliminary signal, a tentative agreement. But the qualifiers were gone. The context was gone. The dependencies were gone. What remained was confidence without scaffolding. That's when I understood the nature of the leverage I held. It wasn't scandal. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't misconduct. It was authorship. I could show, cleanly, unemotionally, that the certainty being presented externally did not match the reality documented internally. That the story had been compressed, not proven. And that this compression wasn't accidental. It followed a consistent pattern of simplification driven by one voice. This wasn't something you expose loudly. It's something you allow to surface under scrutiny. I sat with that realization longer than I expected. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory, just clarity. Because leverage like that isn't about power over someone, it's about alignment with truth. And truth doesn't need to be wielded aggressively to be effective. I asked myself difficult questions that night. If this comes out, who does it affect? What's fair? What's necessary? What's irreversible? I didn't want him embarrassed. I didn't want the project to fail. And I certainly didn't want to be seen as someone who undermined a colleague. What I wanted, clearly, calmly, was correction. But correction only happens when accountability is correctly assigned. And right now, accountability was blurred. I realized then that the moment of reveal shouldn't be engineered. It should be inevitable. So I did nothing dramatic. I finalized my documentation, ensured timelines were clear, ensured my earlier analyses were time-stamped, accessible, and already routed through the right channels. I didn't escalate. I didn't warn. I simply made sure that if the narrative was questioned, the record would answer before I ever had to speak. The next few weeks were strangely quiet. Preparations continued. Messaging was refined. The upcoming interaction with the company's largest shareholder was discussed in increasingly confident terms. He spoke as if the meeting would be a formality. I listened. What struck me was how little curiosity remained in the room. No one was asking, what if, anymore. The language had shifted entirely to when. That's often the moment when systems become fragile, not because they're wrong, but because they're unexamined. I didn't feel nervous. I didn't feel excited. I felt detached, because once you see the structure clearly, you stop reacting to individual moves. You understand that outcomes are already in motion. And the outcome here wasn't humiliation. It was exposure, not of a person, but of a method. When the day came, it wouldn't be about catching anyone out. It would be about allowing a narrative built on confidence to encounter an audience that valued coherence more than charisma. I knew that audience well, and for the first time in a long while, I was certain of something I hadn't felt before. I wouldn't need to speak much at all. There's a moment before anything irreversible happens, when you're forced to choose not between right and wrong, but between restraint and action. I reached that moment quietly. The shareholder meeting was officially on the calendar now. Prep sessions were happening more frequently. Leadership was focused on alignment, tone, and narrative flow. The substance, it seemed, was considered settled. That's when I was asked a question that mattered. A senior leader stopped by my desk late one afternoon and said, almost casually, "You're comfortable with where this is landing, right?" It wasn't a formal request. It wasn't framed as a challenge. It was an assumption wrapped in politeness. And in that moment, I had options. I could have said yes and meant, I've already documented my concerns. I could have said no and reopened discussions that would inevitably become political. I could have escalated, forcing a confrontation before the meeting ever happened. Each option had consequences. Saying yes preserved harmony, but guaranteed misalignment. Saying no would make me the obstacle again. Escalating would look like self-preservation, not principle. What I realized, standing there, was that none of those paths actually corrected the core issue. They just shifted how it would be perceived. So I chose a fourth option. I said, everything I've flagged is already in the materials. Beyond that, I'm comfortable letting the discussion happen. It was true, it was complete, and it changed everything. That sentence did something subtle but powerful. It transferred ownership without drama. I wasn't endorsing the narrative. I wasn't resisting it. I was acknowledging that the process had reached its next stage. From that point on, there was no turning back. The decision wasn't to expose him. It was to stop protecting the system from its own assumptions. After that, I withdrew even further, not in presence, but in influence. I stopped offering unsolicited insights. I limited my contributions to direct questions. I maintained the record and nothing more. He, meanwhile, stepped fully into the spotlight. He led rehearsals, refined talking points, took charge of framing potential questions from the shareholder. He spoke with absolute confidence about what would and wouldn't be challenged. I watched him dismiss certain lines of inquiry as unlikely with a wave of his hand. I didn't interrupt. The closer the meeting got, the more people deferred to his judgment. It was easier that way. He sounded certain. He sounded prepared. He sounded like someone who had already succeeded. Certainty is contagious. And that's when I knew the decision had already done its work. Because by choosing not to intervene, I had allowed him to overplay his hand, not out of malice, but out of comfort. He believed the narrative was settled because no one was pushing back anymore. He mistook absence of resistance for proof. The night before the meeting, I reviewed my files one last time, not nervously, not obsessively, just to confirm that everything was where it should be. It was. I slept well. That surprised me. I wasn't waiting for chaos. I wasn't hoping for failure. I was simply ready for clarity, whatever form it took. The next day would decide nothing about my competence. That had already been proven, quietly, over years. What it would decide was whether confidence built on simplification could withstand a single, focused conversation with someone who asked the right questions. And if it couldn't, the outcome wouldn't be mine to engineer. It would be his to own. The decision point had passed. All that remained was to let the moment arrive. The morning of the shareholder meeting felt strangely ordinary. No tension in the air, no last-minute panic. People moved through the office with the quiet confidence that comes from believing everything is under control. Calendars were clear, slides were finalized. The narrative was locked. I arrived early, as usual. Not to prepare. There was nothing left to prepare, but to observe. to see how people carried themselves when they believed the outcome was already decided. He was already there when I walked in, relaxed, chatting easily with two executives near the conference room. He looked like someone about to be rewarded, not examined. When he saw me, he gave a friendly nod, no edge, no anxiety. To him, I was part of the background now, supportive, aligned, harmless. That suited me. As people gathered, the dynamic was clear. He was leading, others deferred. Questions were framed around how best to present, not whether the presentation itself held up. I took my seat slightly off to the side, close enough to hear everything, far enough not to be central. The meeting began on time. The opening went smoothly. He walked through the strategy with practiced ease, hitting every point with confidence. The shareholder listened attentively, occasionally nodding, occasionally jotting something down. For the first few minutes, it looked exactly as everyone expected. Then the questions began. They were calm, precise, unemotional. Can you walk me through how this assumption was validated? What happens if this dependency shifts by even a small margin? When was this risk last stress tested? Each question landed softly and cut deeply. At first, he responded well. He reframed. He generalized. He leaned on language that had always served him before. We're comfortable with that. We've aligned internally. We've seen positive indicators. But the shareholder didn't move on. They followed up. Who specifically validated that? What data supports that confidence? Is that documented anywhere? The room grew quieter, not tense, just focused. I watched as his answers grew longer and less precise. He began referencing conversations instead of documents, signals instead of results, alignment instead of evidence. And then it happened. The shareholder turned slightly in their chair and asked, "Is there anyone else here who has worked directly on the risk modeling for this?" There was a pause. No one looked at me at first. Then someone did. Not dramatically, just a glance, curious, searching. The shareholder followed the look. "Brian," they said, reading my name from the table placard. "You were involved in this, correct?" I nodded, yes. "Can you clarify how this assumption was addressed internally?" I didn't hesitate, not because I was eager, but because everything I needed to say had already been said months ago in writing. I spoke plainly, no emphasis, no correction of anyone else's statements. I described the assumption, the variables, the status of validation. I didn't contradict him. I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I simply aligned my words with the record. The difference was immediate. The shareholder asked to see the documentation. I had it. Not printed, not theatrically presented, already shared through the appropriate channels, already accessible. As they reviewed it, the room stayed silent. No one interrupted, no one defended, no one explained. The contrast did all the work. What followed wasn't an explosion, it was a recalibration. The shareholder asked a few more questions, this time directed at leadership, clarifying questions, structural questions, the kind that force a pause. He didn't speak again, not because he was silenced, but because there was nothing left to add. The narrative he'd built hadn't collapsed, it had simply been outgrown by the facts. And facts, once centered, don't raise their voice. When the meeting ended, there were no raised eyebrows, no visible embarrassment, just a collective understanding that something had shifted. Ownership had been reassigned, quietly, permanently. I gathered my things and left the room the same way I'd entered, unremarkable. Except now, everyone knew exactly where the substance lived. The consequences didn't announce themselves. There was no immediate fallout, no emergency meetings, no sharp emails sent in the hour after the shareholder left the building. If you were looking for drama, you would have been disappointed. What followed instead was something far more telling, a subtle redistribution of attention. In the days after the meeting, conversations slowed down. Decisions that had once moved quickly were suddenly revisited. Language shifted from certainty back to inquiry. People began asking questions they hadn't felt comfortable asking before. Not out loud, not in groups, but quietly, individually. They came to my desk again. Not urgently, not apologetically, just differently. "Can I run something by you? Have you seen this assumption before? What do you think the risk actually is here?" The tone wasn't deferential. It was cautious, curious, as if people were recalibrating where clarity truly lived. He noticed too. At first, it showed up in small ways. He spoke less in meetings, not because he was excluded, but because the room no longer leaned forward when he did. His certainty didn't carry the same momentum. It met questions now, requests for specifics, follow-ups. None of this was confrontational. That's what made it difficult to push against. No one was challenging him. They were verifying him. That's a very different thing. Leadership didn't say anything directly, at least not publicly, but I could see the shift in how information flowed. Drafts came to me earlier. Reviews included my name. Conversations looped me in before conclusions were drawn. The system was correcting itself, not because someone had failed, but because the illusion of infallibility had been removed. And illusions, once gone, don't return quietly. He tried to adapt. You could see the effort. He added more caveats to his language, asked more questions, slowed his pace. But the rhythm had changed. Previously, his confidence filled the room because no one else was grounding it. Now, the grounding was visible, documented, present. And that visibility couldn't be undone. The hardest part for him wasn't the loss of influence. It was the loss of narrative control. He could no longer frame complexity as optional. He could no longer wave away uncertainty with alignment. Because someone else, calmly, consistently, was doing the opposite. And that someone wasn't louder, just clearer. I didn't celebrate this shift. I didn't even acknowledge it internally. I kept doing exactly what I'd always done, only now, people noticed the difference between volume and substance. What surprised me most was how little resentment there was. No one blamed him, no one whispered, no one gossiped. They simply adjusted. That's how real consequences usually unfold, not as punishment, but as reweighting. Attention flows where reliability is felt. Trust follows coherence. Over time, his role narrowed. He was still present, still capable, still articulate, but no longer central. And once centrality is lost in a system like that, it doesn't come back through performance alone. It requires rebuilding credibility, slowly, quietly, without shortcuts. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I had done exactly that work, without recognition. Now, he was being asked to do the same. The difference was that I hadn't expected applause. He had. And that expectation made the transition harder. As for me, nothing about my title changed. Nothing about my job description shifted. But the way people listened did. And listening, real listening, is the beginning of influence. The consequences had begun. Not loudly, not publicly, but unmistakably. By the time he realized what had happened, the window to fix it had already closed. Not because anyone had shut him out, but because the conditions that once protected him were gone. He tried, at first, to reassert control through effort, longer hours, more preparation, more detailed decks. On the surface, it looked like growth, and to his credit, some of it was. But effort can't replace trust, once trust has shifted direction. Meetings that he used to lead became collaborative by default. People asked for sources now. Timelines were challenged. Comfortable with was no longer an acceptable answer. He adapted his language, but not his position. The problem wasn't that he couldn't learn. It was that his earlier confidence had been based on occupying space, not holding structure. And once that distinction became visible, it followed him everywhere. I remember one meeting in particular. He presented an updated proposal, clearly overcorrecting, layers of contingencies, cautious phrasing, detailed slides. It was competent, it was thorough. And it fell flat, not because it was wrong, but because the room was no longer calibrated to his voice as the default authority. Questions were redirected, clarifications were sought from others, sometimes from me. Not pointedly, not dramatically, just naturally. Afterward, he approached me privately for the first time in months. He didn't accuse, he didn't apologize. He just said, "If there's something you think I'm missing, I'd appreciate knowing." It was a reasonable request. And too late. Not because I wanted to withhold anything, but because nothing I could say would restore what had already shifted. The issue wasn't information, it was timing. I told him the truth, gently. Most of what you're dealing with now was already in the material. It's just being weighed differently. He nodded, thanked me, left. That conversation stayed with me, not out of guilt, but out of recognition. This was the moment people imagine will fix things. The quiet, professional exchange where misunderstandings are cleared up. But misunderstandings weren't the problem. Patterns were, and patterns, once exposed, don't revert on command. Leadership didn't intervene to help him regain footing, not out of cruelty, but out of pragmatism. The system had found a new equilibrium, and systems resist disruption, even when the disruption comes from someone trying to reclaim lost ground. He still contributed, still spoke, still worked. But the unspoken authority, the thing he'd relied on, was gone. I could see the frustration settling in, not explosive, just internal, a subtle tightening, less ease, more self-monitoring. For someone used to flowing freely through rooms, that kind of constraint is exhausting. And there was nothing he could point to, no incident, no accusation, no moment he could contest. That's what made it irreversible. If someone tells you what you did wrong, you can respond. If a system stops responding the way it used to, there's nothing to argue with. The irony was sharp, but quiet. The same dynamic I'd lived with for years was now his reality. Being heard privately, being deferred publicly, being useful, but no longer influential. I didn't feel satisfaction watching this unfold. I felt something closer to closure. Because this wasn't about him losing something, it was about the system rediscovering balance. And once balance returns, it doesn't apologize for where it lands. By the time he understood that, there was no lever left to pull. The moment had passed. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. It took place in a small conference room, with the lights half dimmed, late in the afternoon. No audience, no urgency, just 2 chairs, a table, and the low hum of the building settling into evening. He had asked for the meeting. By then, the shift in the room dynamics was undeniable. His role had narrowed, mine had clarified, and there was a tension that hadn't been spoken, but had been felt for weeks. He didn't waste time. "I need to understand something," he said. His voice was steady, but careful. "At what point did I lose your support?" The question was telling. Not, did I do something wrong? Not, what should I fix? But when did you stop backing me? I paused, not for effect, but because the answer deserved precision. "I never supported or opposed you," I said. "I supported the work." He frowned slightly, not defensively, confused. "It didn't feel that way," he replied. "You used to speak up more." "I used to correct assumptions," I said calmly. "Then I documented them instead." That landed differently. He leaned back, processing. "So you just let it happen?" I shook my head. "No, I made sure it was visible." There was no accusation in my voice, no edge, just fact. He exhaled slowly. "You could have said something." "I did," I said, repeatedly, early, in writing. That was the moment the room went quiet, not tense, resolved. He wasn't angry, I could see that now. He was recalculating, trying to find the version of events where this had been personal. And there wasn't one. "I didn't think it mattered that much," he said finally. "That's the difference," I replied. "I did." We sat there for a moment. No one rushed to fill the silence. "I never meant to push you out," he added. "I know," I said, "and I meant it." That seemed to surprise him more than anything else. "I don't think you were trying to," I continued. "But you also weren't checking." He nodded slowly. That was it. No apology, no demands, no attempt to rewrite the past. The conversation ended the way it began, quietly. As we stood to leave, he said something that stayed with me. "I didn't realize how much space I was taking until it wasn't there anymore." I met his gaze. Most people don't. And that was the closest thing to closure either of us needed. Because the truth is, not every conflict requires resolution. Some require recognition. We walked out of the room separately. No hostility, no triumph, just clarity. I didn't become someone new after all of this. That's the part people usually expect, the transformation, the sharper edge, the louder voice, the visible rise. But none of that happened. Not because it couldn't have, but because it wasn't necessary. What changed was not my personality, it was my position. I'm still quiet in meetings. I still listen more than I speak. I still choose my words carefully and stop when I've said enough. The difference now is that when I do speak, the room adjusts. Not because I demand it, because people have learned, through experience, where clarity comes from. I no longer feel the need to prove anything. That urgency is gone. When you've seen how quickly narratives collapse under scrutiny, you stop trying to build your own out of ego. You focus instead on coherence, on truth that holds, even when you're not in the room. That's where I am now. People loop me in earlier, not formally, but instinctively. Drafts arrive, with questions instead of conclusions. When someone says, "Let's check with Brian," it's not about validation, it's about direction. And I don't correct that assumption, not because I'm protecting a status shift, but because I've earned the right to let it stand. What surprised me most was how little bitterness I carried forward. I had expected some residue, resentment maybe, or a desire to avoid certain people, but none of that stuck. Once the dynamic resolved itself, the emotional charge disappeared with it. I don't think less of him now. In fact, I understand him better. I've seen how easy it is to confuse momentum with mastery and how forgiving systems can be until they aren't. He still works here. We still interact. The tension is gone, not because we resolved every difference, but because the ambiguity is gone. We both know where we stand, and that knowledge is stabilizing. As for me, I've learned something I didn't fully grasp before. Invisibility isn't always imposed. Sometimes it's enabled. And reclaiming agency doesn't require confrontation. It requires alignment with reality. I no longer overfunction to compensate for others' certainty. I don't rescue narratives that aren't ready to stand. I don't smooth over gaps that belong to someone else's ownership. That restraint isn't passive. It's ethical, because it allows systems to reveal themselves honestly. And honesty, even when uncomfortable, is the only foundation that lasts. If there's a quiet confidence in me now, it doesn't come from winning anything. It comes from knowing that I don't need to manage how I'm perceived anymore. The work speaks, and the record supports it. That's enough. And if I ever find myself slipping back into predictability, I know exactly what to watch for. Not disrespect, not dismissal, but assumption. Because assumption is where quiet people are most often misplaced, and where quiet correction, when it comes, is most powerful. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for a villain, to simplify it into arrogance versus humility, loud versus quiet, right versus wrong. But that framing misses the point, and it misses the lesson. No one here was evil, no rules were broken, no lines were crossed loudly enough to force intervention. What happened unfolded inside a system that rewarded confidence, speed, and narrative momentum, and quietly sidelined caution, depth, and restraint. Until it didn't. The real shift wasn't exposure, it was alignment. Alignment between what was said and what was true, between who spoke and who carried the substance, between confidence and evidence. And alignment doesn't need aggression to assert itself. It only needs patience and record. If there's a moral here, it's not stay quiet and wait. Silence alone solves nothing. Silence without intention simply reinforces whatever dynamic already exists. But silence with structure, silence backed by clarity, silence that refuses to compensate for someone else's certainty, that changes systems. You don't have to embarrass anyone to be seen. You don't have to shout to be heard. And you don't have to expose people to let them reveal themselves. Most dynamics collapse under their own weight when given enough room and accurate reflection. The hardest part, for many people, is resisting the urge to rescue outcomes that don't belong to them, to correct narratives prematurely, to protect others from the consequences of their own overconfidence. But when you do that, you're not being generous. You're being invisible on their behalf. What I learned is this: your responsibility ends where ownership begins. Once something is documented, shared, and understood, you are not obligated to carry it alone, especially not to preserve someone else's image. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about restraint. It's about choosing not to interfere with reality, even when doing so would make you temporarily more comfortable. And when reality finally meets scrutiny, it doesn't need your help. It stands on its own. So if you're someone who's been underestimated, not loudly dismissed, not openly challenged, but slowly edited out, this isn't a call to become louder or sharper. It's a reminder to become precise, to document, to align with truth, to let systems show you what they reward and what they eventually correct, and then to decide calmly where you stand. I'm curious, have you ever experienced a moment where staying quiet wasn't weakness, but preparation? If so, I'd genuinely like to hear how it unfolded for you.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.